Welcome back. This is episode 4 of What Does It Mean to Be Well? 5 episodes that we're doing for Mental Health Awareness Month. So far, we've named the gap between not sick and actually flourishing. We've looked honestly at the church and what it does well and the areas that it's still a little bit slow in. We've gotten personal about what broken self love looks like and what it costs. And today, I want to talk about the science because some of what I've been describing is not just philosophically true or theologically grounded. It's measurable, and that matters more than you might think. I'm Jen Collier. I work at the intersection of applied positive psychology, Christian psychology, and coaching psychology. Understanding that some of flourishing is measurable changes everything because if flourishing is something that can be observed, studied, and supported with documented practices, it's not some kind of luxury. It's not a sign of shallow faith or self indulgence. It's something real that real people can pursue with intention. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to be careful here, though, because I love the posture of trust. Trust is really important. I've spent significant portions of my life learning what it means to actually release control and trust God with things that I cannot manage. That's not what I'm questioning. What I'm questioning is the version of trust that looks like passivity. The idea that if we just wait and pray, flourishing will happen to us. We don't treat a broken leg with prayer alone and see if God heals it while we ignore going to the doctor. We trust God and we engage in the mechanisms that He built into the body for healing. The same logic applies here too. Flourishing has documented mechanisms. Engaging them is not a lack of faith, it's actually stewardship. So here's the distinction that matters most in this entire series. Think of well being as a number line. To the left of 0, suffering, illness, depression. The work of removing that suffering, whether it be through therapy, medication, crisis intervention, that moves you towards 0. And that's critically important work. But 0 is not flourishing. 0 is the absence of illness. And moving from 0 to the right, towards genuine well being, active flourishing, and an abundant life is a different journey and it requires different tools. And most people and most systems stop at 0 and call that success. So here's what made me sit up when I encountered it in my research. Some positive psychology interventions do both of these at the same time. They alleviate things like depression and build well being in the same person, not just moving from minus to 0, but moving somewhere below 0 to a plus. And that's not an accident. It's because these interventions address the whole person, the full system, rather than just targeting the symptom. And it's consistent with what the Christian tradition has always argued. You cannot split the human person into parts and only treat one of them. Heart, soul, mind, strength, these are integrated. Address all of them and the effects compound. So I want to tell you about the most significant act of trust in my adult life. Justin, my husband, has always had a heart for the sea. His dream for as long as I've known him was to sail. And when our kids were about 9 and 14, we were still homeschooling, and we looked at each other one day and we thought we could actually do something crazy. We could buy a sailboat, move aboard, and create a missional community among other boating families in the Caribbean. So we did what you do when God puts something in front of you and it won't go away. Well, first we prayed a lot. We went to missionary training. We bought a sailboat in St. Martin. We sold our home in Texas and nearly everything that we owned, everything that didn't fit into a 10 by 10 storage unit. And we prepared to leave. The day that we were moving out of our house was September 6th. We were starting a road trip to go see family before leaving the mainland for good. And that same day, Hurricane Irma, which was a massive Category 5 hurricane, made direct landfall on St. Martin. I really cannot express how fortunate we were compared to most of the others who were impacted by the hurricane. Thanks to insurance, we were not financially impacted. We were safe and we had options. For weeks, though, we didn't know if Magic Dolphin, our boat, had survived. And as details started to trickle in, it became clear that things were not good. She had been dismasted, there was a massive hole in her hull, and we had no home behind us. And now we had no home ahead of us. And I was really, really angry. We had really risked everything, our home, our possessions, our children's stability, 18 months of clear and consistent signs from God, only to end up basically homeless and essentially possessionless, staying in my mom's home. I felt really betrayed. I want to be really honest about that. Faith does not always protect you from the feeling of betrayal when the thing you trusted God for falls apart in front of you. What I came to understand over time, though, was that God had even bigger plans for us, or at least they were different ones that would eventually meet a personal dream that I had carried since childhood. But I couldn't see that yet. What I could see was that we had to cut the dock lines, trust him, and dive into an adventure to find out what it actually looked like to journey with Jesus when you have nothing left to fall back on. I have an Oswald Chambers quote in a blog I wrote about that year that I've never been able to quite shake. And it was actually one of the significant signposts in us making the decision to pursue the dream that God had given us. If you yourselves do not cut the lines that tie you to the dock, God will have to use a storm to sever them. Put everything in your life afloat upon God, going out to sea on the great swelling tide of his purpose, and your eyes will be opened. In our case, the storm was quite literal, and our eyes were opened. What I learned in that season about trust, actual, physical, material trust, not just the theoretical kind, is something that no amount of studying could have taught me. We had to trust him enough to leave behind what was fine, what was comfortable, manageable, basically languishing, to grow into what was genuinely inspiring. And that required losing the thing that we thought we were supposed to have. And I'm telling you this in the research episode, weirdly, because expansive vulnerability is not a spiritual concept that I read about. It's a posture I was forced into when God stripped away everything that I thought the plan was. It's being willing to press out into the unknown in the state of trust that forces us outside of the bounds that holds us captive. And what I found on the other side of that stripping away was that the mechanisms of flourishing that the research describes, trust, surrender, purposeful suffering, the kind of hope that does not depend on circumstances, they're not abstract. They're practiced, they're lived, and they're available to anyone who is willing to cut the lines to the dock. What I found in the research confirmed what that season had taught me, that the relationship with God is not one item on the list of things that make life good. It's the precondition for them all. And the literature now has a name for that. So when I conducted the research for my master's dissertation, I was doing a systematic analysis of the well-being constructs that appear in Christian psychology literature, cataloging what the field actually says about human flourishing in Christ. And something emerged that I wasn't fully expecting. There was a category of well-being constructs, communion with God, intimacy with God, the quality of that relationship that didn't fit anywhere in the existing positive psychology framework. Not because positive psychology is wrong, but because it wasn't built to hold these kind of constructs. They're irreducible. You can't call them spirituality and capture what they actually are. There's something else. What I ended up calling covenantal well-being. The binding, communal, initiated by God relationship that's not a feature of Christian well-being, but it's its foundation. That finding really mattered to me personally because it's what I had experienced, that the relationship with God was not one item on the list of things that make life good. It was a precondition for all of them. One of the constructs that falls under covenantal well-being in the research is hope, specifically eschatological hope, which is the kind that's anchored in who God is and where history is going. And hope, it turns out, is not just a feeling, it's protective, and its absence has consequences. I want to say something carefully because the person I'm about to reference has a dear, dear beloved family, and I will not be careless with his story. But 5 years ago, I lost a friend. And what I want to say about him is not that he had a mental illness. I cannot say that with for certainty, and it would not be the point even if I could. What I can say is that he had given up hope. And I want to make a distinction that I think matters enormously because both personally and in the research, it makes a difference. Lacking hope is not the same thing as having a mental illness, but lacking hope is poor mental health. And the difference between those two things is one of the most important distinctions we can make when we talk about what the church is equipped to address. Hope, and specifically the kind of eschatological hope that shows up in the Christian psychology literature, is a documented protective factor for mental health. It's not just a feeling, it's a construct. It contextualizes suffering. It gives a person the capacity to hold difficulty without being destroyed by it because it orients them towards something beyond the difficulty. The research confirms what the tradition has always said. Hope is not optional for the Christian life. It's structural. And when someone loses that hope, they're not necessarily sick in a clinical sense. They may not meet a diagnostic threshold, but they are not well. They're somewhere in that continuum, not in the middle, not neutral, but not moving in the right direction. And the tragedy, the one that I carry every time I think about him, is that we do not always have the language to recognize that movement until it's too late. We wait for a crisis that announces itself. And sometimes the crisis has been building quietly in the absence of hope for a very long time. That is the cost of only having tools for the left side of this continuum. I'm not saying that what happened to my friend could have been prevented by the right framework. I don't know that at all. What I am saying is that hope, real, grounded, eschatological, Christ anchored hope, is something that we can cultivate intentionally. It's something that the church can teach, model, and build into the architecture of how it forms people. And it's something that the research supports with documented evidence. Earlier this year, I submitted that dissertation proposing a model of Christian well-being grounded in the text of the Greatest Commandment. I want to be honest about where that research came from. I didn't start with the academic question. I started with the personal one. Why does the life that Jesus describes, this abundant, whole, alive life, feel so much further away than I think it should? And what would it actually take to close that gap? I went looking for a framework because I needed one. And what I found in the literature confirmed what I had lived, that the relational hierarchy of loving God, loving self, and loving others is not just a theological claim. It's a documented pattern in the psychological science of Christian flourishing. The model that emerged from that research is what the next episode is about, and the assessment I've built around it is how we would measure it. The Greatest Commandment assessment measures where you are right now across 7 dimensions of whole person well-being, each one grounded in the text of the Greatest Commandment and operationalized through the Christian psychology literature. It is research grade, meaning that the data it generates is designed to be publishable. It's individual facing, meaning it gives you a personal narrative report about your own life, not a congregational health score. And it's free. It does not ask who you are. It asks where you are right now across the 7 dimensions of the life that Jesus described. And that's a different question and a much more useful one. And it's launching this summer. The waitlist is at luke1028.com. So next week is the payoff, the full framework, why it's structured the way it is, what the ordering of the commandment means practically, and what it looks like to pursue this with intention. Everything this series has been building towards lands in episode 5. Again, the waitlist is at luke1028.com. And there is a love yourself pathway in the description if episode 3 is still sitting with you. Additionally, we have a free download for the forgiveness pathway that you can access in the pathway formation on luke1028.com. So I'll see you next week for the last one. But before I let you go, I want to give you one thing to do right now. Before that next video plays, before you pick up or put down your phone, before you open another tab, stop. Take off your shoes if you can. Put both of your feet flat on the floor and feel the ground underneath you. You're here. The same God who designed the mechanism of flourishing that you just heard about designed the body that you are sitting in right now. Take 2 slow breaths and then ask him, where am I on that line today? Let that question sit with you before you go back to your screen. Be blessed.